So I'll ask one time, can you guys on Zoom all hear and see okay? Okay, thanks, Wendy, because I won't look at this anymore. Good morning, all. We do have several people on Zoom. I'll run through. We got Mike Lynch is home today. Steve Turnbull's online. Tim and Diana Post. Rollins there. Belinda, Wendy Dugan, and Brett Hesacker. Is that how you say his last name? Okay. And here, I'll let you guys see. There are some faces here. I'm really glad to see your eyes this morning. I know a lot of people have taken sick, so I wasn't sure if anybody would be here. Maybe I should stay home and do Zoom, but I'm glad to see you all. I was thinking, you know how when you hear someone teach, and sometimes it's the side comments that they make that stick with you. They do all, I do all this preparation, but it's something you don't even intend to say, and it sticks with you. Well, I was thinking about 20 years ago, I had a Bible teacher. I don't know what he was teaching, but he said, someone asked him what his favorite book of the Bible was, or maybe the Old Testament. And he said Deuteronomy. And it kind of surprised me, because if I were to pick an Old Testament book, I wouldn't probably pick Deuteronomy. And I never asked him why, but it just stuck in my head that there must be something in Deuteronomy that maybe I don't know and is worth looking into. So it took me 20 years, but I want to teach through Deuteronomy because I want to see more of what's there. And so to start off, I don't know if any of you are kind of in that boat where you're like, Deuteronomy's an Old Testament book. It's kind of long. And I heard you're going to do 12 weeks in it. Like, how are we going to spend 12 weeks in Deuteronomy? So just a couple things to get us started is, why study Deuteronomy? Why would we spend time on an Old Testament book, and especially 12 weeks in an Old Testament book? Well, this might not be true of anybody in here, but even to think about why would you spend time in the Old Testament could be a question that some people would have. And I think some of the reasons, of course, it's God's word, so that'd be a reason to look at the Old Testament. But when we look at the Old Testament, we see the beginnings of the story of redemption. That if we don't know the Old Testament, we won't know fully how God has worked in history. If we just parachute into the New Testament and think that's where it starts, we won't know a lot of what the New Testament talks about. We won't know fully what covenants mean. We won't know about atonement. We won't know a lot about God's faithfulness or his power or his character. And so I think to know the Old Testament well can help us avoid misunderstanding the New Testament, right? So that's a couple reasons for the Old Testament. But what about Deuteronomy? I was a little surprised. Some of the reading I've done, people talk about Deuteronomy having it's a special place within the Old Testament as well. One, it's the beginning. It's in the first 5 books of the Bible. Remember what the first 5 books are called? Pentateuch, or Torah. The Jewish people would call it the Torah. So it's part of that kind of special place at the beginning of the New Testament. And there's a lot of some people have called Deuteronomy, it's like the Old Testament of the Old Testament. So people who lived in the Old Testament times would sort of look to Deuteronomy as sort of the basis for a lot of what was taught later. If you go to the prophets, a lot of times the prophets in the Old Testament are hearkening back or calling back to what God commanded in Deuteronomy. So it kind of forms the basis of their understanding of how God's working as well. People have called it the theological hub or the engine that drives the Old Testament. And there's more similarities between Deuteronomy and the New Testament. I think we'll see more of this as we get into it. But when you do get to the New Testament, you see a huge draw on Deuteronomy. If you were to think about what books of the Old Testament are most quoted in the New, what would be your guesses? Isaiah, that's number one, so you get the Psalms, that's number two. We're going in order. What's that? Deuteronomy's third. Would you guys put Deuteronomy third, most quoted in the New Testament? Well, when you think about when Jesus was tempted in the desert, we know that he used God's word, right? What exactly did he use? He used Deuteronomy every time to answer the temptations that the devil was giving him. When he was asked what the most important law is, where did he go? He went to Deuteronomy. So we see that that even in Jesus's mind, Deuteronomy is sort of the basis or the most prominent area in the Old Testament where God's law is summarized. So if you were to think about what's in Deuteronomy, what's it about? What do you think Deuteronomy is about? When you, not looking for right answers here, but if you were to think about Deuteronomy, what do you think you would find there? The law, good.
The reapplication of the 20 of Exodus 20.
Okay. You find the 10 Commandments again.
How to raise your kids.
How to raise your kids.
Yep.
Good. Those are a lot of the things. If you were to look, there's also a lot of history that's kind of re-summarized there. We see a huge transition point that we'll get into more. But Deuteronomy comes at a very important decision point for Israel. So many of you, I'm sure you're familiar with, at least somewhat familiar with Deuteronomy, but just in case you're rusty, just a few quick facts about Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy, it's from Moses. If you read through Deuteronomy, a lot of it's sermons that Moses gave. Whether or not he penned it, actually wrote it, isn't so much the question, but we know that the words that are in there are Moses's words, and people look to it as a couple of sermons actually that he gave, and then he put together, or were put together at some point. There's one reason why we know Moses couldn't write all of it. Anybody remember? Dick's smiling. Yeah, it does talk about his death. So he could have known about that ahead of time. We know God can reveal things to him, but most likely that was added by somebody else at least, or anyway, after he did actually die. When you get to the beginning of Deuteronomy, this is chapter 1, verse 5. It says that, kind of here, beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to explain this law, and then he goes on. The title, Deuteronomy, it can be a little bit confusing because you might think it means like second law. If you know, is that Latin? Is the Deut? I don't know if that prefix, or is that, okay. It's not a second law added to the first. As John said, it's would you say it's a restatement? Reapplication of the law. So it's telling again the law that they had heard already. And specifically, this would be the law that Moses had received on Sinai. So he's telling this law again. That's why you've got the 10 Commandments are given in Exodus, right? But they're also given again here in Deuteronomy. So Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5 is where you can find the 10 Commandments. And then the setting then, again, it's a second statement of the law given 40 years after it was first received by Moses on Mount Sinai. As the verse I read said, it says, beyond the Jordan. So when we talk about beyond the Jordan, that would be to the east side of the Jordan River, right? So And what this is getting at is that they'd received the law at Sinai. Then they had the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Now they're at the border of the promised land, about ready to enter. And this is where Deuteronomy fits. So it's going to be recalling their history that they've had up to that point, and then calling them again to faithfulness to this covenant that God's given them. Okay. So what's it about? Essentially, Moses is trying to get them ready to enter into the land, to be faithful. He's calling them to covenant faithfulness. Not only that, but we'll find out that Moses himself, as you know, doesn't get to go into the promised land. So it's also a transition of leadership from Moses to Joshua, right? So that's kind of, in a nutshell, that's what Deuteronomy is about. They're standing here on the border of the promised land, about ready to enter. Are they going to be faithful or not? And this is what Moses is calling them to be faithful, to remember what God has promised them, what he's promised to do for them and among them. And the question then is, are they going to be faithful or not? Okay. If you were, let's say, John, you said this is a lot about parenting. In some ways, you know, you could think about Deuteronomy as your kid's grown up in the church and they're just about ready to go to college. You got to give them a talk to get them ready, because you're not going to be around to help them anymore or remind them of what you've taught them. So what would you say to a kid who's about ready to go off to college? Just happen to see there is one. Yeah, Jen?
I said to Audra just this past couple of months ago was just, remember, no matter what your teachers teach you, the Bible is true.
Mm.
The words of the Bible are what you go back to, not the words of your instructors.
Okay. And do you see how that could be applicable even for the Israelites about to enter the land? Who would they be hearing when they went into the land? The people who lived there before, the Canaanites. So there'd be all kinds of temptations for them to be pulled away from what they were seeing and hearing as well. So that'd be a great one. Any other thoughts about that? It's a mindset really of thinking, this is the last thing I get to say to you. What's it going to be? What am I going to tell you that's going to help you stay faithful? But at first I was thinking it's sort of like a parent talking to a kid going to college, but it's actually more than that. It's more like you're, talking to a kid going to college. When your parents went to college, they were foolish and they completely abandoned the Lord, and now they're dead. What are you going to do? Like that's the real situation that Israel's facing. Is that, remember, the reason why they were in the wilderness for 40 years was that all that generation would die, right? So now these are the children who have seen this happen. And now the question to them is, what are you going to do? You saw your parents' choice and what happened with them. Now, what are you going to do? Okay. Okay. Any thoughts or questions so far? What I want to do to get started is the first 3 or 4 chapters. It's summarizing the history of what has happened in their time so far. And I'm not very creative, but what I want to try to do is I want to pretend that you are the one who grew up in Egypt, that you were born as a child, in slavery. You saw all the things happen, and now you're going to be standing here on the plains of Moab, looking out over to the promised land and seeing what you will do. Okay, so I'm not going to be very consistent. But I'm going to try to act like you are the kid who grew up, and we'll be reading through Deuteronomy, the first couple chapters, and just trying to kind of paint the scene for you, so that when you get to Moab, you kind of feel something of what they must be feeling when they were there. Okay, All right, so you are now 45 years old. To be 45 again, or 45, and how are you still alive? I'm not sure what perspective you've got. And for all of your entire life, all that you can remember, even the history of everybody that you've been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. Think about, our own country in 400 years ago. What was happening about in the 1622s? I remember history. You're a history buff, I know. That's when the Pilgrims were first starting to come over, right? How connected do we feel as a country to our Pilgrims, apart from Thanksgiving and remembering them?
Not much anymore.
Yeah, like the day-to-day, we don't really feel connected with them. And you think about somebody who's been a slave in Egypt for 400 years, what would they remember about the promises that God had made to people 400 years ago about a land that they'd never seen before? They didn't know anything about Israel. They'd never been there before, right? So that's the situation that you've grown up with. The elders in your tribe, they're still talking about the patriarchs. They still talk about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They still talk about this land that God had promised to them. But that was a long time ago. And a lot has happened. And everything that you know in your life now has been slavery. You've been making bricks for the last, since you were 8 or however old you were. Okay. But when you were a child now, God showed up in a big way with you and your people. That though you were slaves for so long, God showed up and very powerfully brought you out of that land, out of Egypt, out of slavery. Moses preached it very well. He says, "Has any God ever attempted to go and take a nation for himself from the midst of another nation by trials and signs, by wonders and by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great deeds of terror, all of which the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes?" You guys saw this happen. You saw all the plagues. You saw the resistance that Pharaoh put up. You saw the firstborn of everybody else in Egypt dying, but not in your families. That's what you remember about what God has done. And you remember that after that escape from Egypt, you went to a mountain, right? And that's where Moses went up into the clouds and received the 10 Commandments. But let me draw a quick map because we got a couple geography things, and this will be helpful. So this is my cartoon drawing of Israel. I would just do this. So this is the Mediterranean. So there's some water here. You might know what this would be. This is water. And then this, not much water, but that's the Dead Sea. Okay. So that's all I usually do, but now I got to bring in Egypt. So this is what I'm going to look. To me, it looked like a M, kind of. So this is Egypt over here. And then this is Sinai. All right. So they were slaves here in Egypt, but they kind of occupied Sinai, wasn't it? Pretty sure that's where is that the land that the Jewish people were given? There's a word I can't bring to mind, but anyway.
Goshen.
Goshen, yeah. Where was Goshen? Never mind. Look that up another time. That's not really part of this. But Sinai is where Mount Sinai was, and we don't know exactly where it was, but let's just say it's here. We're going to draw a mountain here. So here's Mount Sinai. So after you were redeemed from Egypt, you went down here to Mount Sinai, okay? And when you were there at Mount Sinai, you stayed at the base with everybody else, and Moses went to the top. And it was an unforgettable day there was lightning, smoke, there was earthquakes. This was not a day that will ever be forgotten by anybody. And when Moses returned from the mountain, he had heard from the Lord and had God's commands for you as a people. He had the 10 commandments written on stone. And it was then that you really started to feel like we're no longer slaves in Egypt. We're becoming our own people. Not just our own people, but we're a people who's belonging to this God, the one who's just redeemed us out of Israel. And now he's given us this command for us to follow him. This is how we should live in response to what he's done for us. Okay. So from here, from Mount Sinai, then you started heading north, about green, and don't remember exactly how you got there, but you came to a place called a city called Kadesh Barnea. I'm not going to put it out. Let's just say KB. So where's the promised land here? It's right in here. So this is Israel. This would be the land that was promised to them. So here you're on your way. You're about ready to enter into the promised land. And do you guys remember what your parents did at Kadesh Barnea? So when we got here, this is where there were a ton of people. It took us forever to get here. It was we were so disorganized. There's like 2.5 million people here, and it took us the good part of a week and a half just to get to this little area here. So when we got here, we needed to get some organization. All right. So what Moses did was he established some judges to work in our tribes, and we also got an army that was formed, because Moses didn't want to hear all of our complaining all by himself. He needed somebody else to help him hear these cases and help with deciding between disputes. But then we also got an army that was formed. We had commanders at every level. We had top commanders all the way down to commanders of small groups. Now, why do we need an army? Why did we need to get an army at this point right here? Weren't we just going to go and get our land? What was the reason for an army?
We were gonna need to, or we, I guess, or our parents were supposed to go and take possession of the land by force.
Okay. There were already people up here. That was a problem. That's the land that the God had promised to us, but there were people there. So what we did, if you remember, the first thing our parents did was they got a group of guys together, some spies, to go out, and they went all through the land here to see what it was like, right? Because they thought, well, if this is the land we're supposed to take, we want to know, is this going to be an easy thing or a bad thing? Is this worth doing or not? What did they find when they went into the land? Was it a bunch of rocks? And no, they brought back fruit, showing that the land was plentiful, that it was good to live there. However, do you remember what most of these spies said? What did they say about it? Yeah, they're huge. Okay, so 12 people went up. I think it was 10 came back and said, they're way too big. There's no way we're going to go up there and take them. But 2 came back and said, with God's help, we can do this. So who are those 2 again? Caleb and Joshua. Okay. So that's what happened here at Kadesh Barnea. They could have gone into the land here. They had everything they needed. They had God's promise that this was belonging to them by promise. They had his word. They had an army. All they had to do was go into the land. But what did they do instead? They were chickens. They said, no way, we're not going to do it. And because of that, because they listened to the report of these 10, how do you put this? God was not happy with them. So because of that decision, because of that fear of going into the land, because of their unbelief of God's promises, God said, none of you are going to see the land, or none of you are going to go into the land. In fact, I'm going to take you for 40 years, because that's about how long you're going to live. And 40 years of, I'm going to lead you through the wilderness until that generation's all dead. They will not inherit the promised land that I had sworn to them. So that's what was happening then for the 40 years. But one thing to remember, we know that this was the land that God had promised them way back in Genesis, right? If you go back to God's promises to Abraham, he promised land. Do you remember what else God promised to Abraham? Descendants. So he would have a couple descendants at least. He would have as many as the stars in heaven, right? As many as the stars that he'd see. If you went back to Genesis, you could read in 12 is when it's first stated, but also in 15 is where I'm going to read. He said he brought him outside. He brought Abraham outside, and he said, "Look toward heaven and number the stars if you are able to number them." But then God said to him, "So shall your offspring be." So a long time ago, God had promised to Abraham that he would have more descendants that he could even count. Now we've got somewhere around 2.5 million people coming up out of Egypt. Could be a little bit more or less. But in Deuteronomy 10, it says, again, Moses is recounting, our fathers went down to Egypt, 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as stars in heaven. Right? So we're seeing that God is fulfilling his promises that he had made to Abraham a long time ago, both in the people, his descendants, but now also the land. So that's what you have in your mind now is God's been faithful to us. Look at all these people here. This is what God actually promised to us. And now he's saying that he will take us into the land. Right? Okay. Let's see, go on. Okay, so imagine if you were one of the parents here. What do you think you would do if you were seeing God's promises that he's fulfilled in terms of people? Now he's telling you that that land up there is also yours. But all these people are saying, you know, that the people who live there are giants. Like, maybe this isn't the right time to go. What do you guys think you would have done?
Well, it's also interesting that God's word to Abraham, including the slavery, and that you're going to come out and you're going to have many possessions. You know, it's following the script, and the script is followed. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of reasons to say, like, I didn't think all the rest of this was going to happen, and it has. Maybe God's going to fulfill the rest of it too.
Yeah, that should be a reason to trust him in the future, right? When you look back and see he's been faithful in the past, everything that he said has come true, whether it's in our own seeing or maybe in a future time. Hopefully we would say that, right? But I wonder how many times we're faced with things that come up in our life, and we know that God's with us. He's promised to be with us. He's promised that he can help us to carry our burdens and our anxieties. And yet when we face the day, or when we see the person that we're having a hard time with, we falter, right? We question whether, is God really going to come through? Maybe I better do something else to prepare in advance, or to sort of circumvent what I think I need to do. So I think that place of trusting God, it's been true for them, and it's true for us today. It's been true of all of God's people all through history. that even though God's been always proven to be faithful, yet we always struggle with whether we can really trust him or not. And I think this is a good chance for us to remember that, and also to see then how it is that Moses is preparing them to trust him at this point too. Yeah, John?
I think we need to remember that if Adam, who was created good, chose that one thing that was evil, how can we who are created evil choose the one thing that's good, even Jesus Christ?
Mm-hmm. It's true. Yeah, and even though we also have more benefits than maybe the people standing at Kadesh Barnea, more time to see God's faithfulness, more time to see his Messiah that he's brought, and yet we're still struggling with that, with trusting him. Anything else? Okay. Okay, so this is the point then at this city here. This is where the people didn't trust in the Lord, and that's what caused them the next 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. I don't know why wandering seems like it's kind of pointless, but I think God was leading them, right? It wasn't they were just kind of like figuring out what to do next, but God was leading them in the wilderness time, which is another good thing for us to remember, that even though we might be disciplined by the Lord, it's not just that he forgets about us, that he's active in our life when he disciplines us, just as he was active in Israel's life. Anyway, so now back to you guys being kids. The next, let's say, almost 40 years, a lot happened, but I'm not going to tell you all that happened. I'm going to fast forward to the last part of the trip here, which is what Deuteronomy does, where you're over, who knows what direction you've gone here, but on this side of the Jordan River, a lot of times you'll see it'll talk about beyond the river. This is what it's talking about, is beyond this thing. So it's outside the promised land, beyond the river, which is the Jordan. And I think even down here, it can be considered beyond the river. But there were some groups over here that lived, if I can get the order right, I think it was Edomites, but Deuteronomy calls them, it calls it Seir, I think, Seir. That's who lived there. Up above that was Moab. And then up above here was, who was that? I drew it on my map. Oh, the Ammonites. So Ammon. Oh, that's right. So in current day Jordan, I have a coworker that lives in Jordan, and he lives in Ammon, so I can remember it's Ammon. It's somewhere over here. Over in this area, this is mainly where the Amorites lived. And it's kind of like, a lot of times you hear the Canaanites. That was the majority group there, was the Amorites. So as they came around this way, in Deuteronomy, we see Israel encountering these three different groups here. And every time, God says, don't mess with these people, because this is the land that I gave to them. This is, I think is it Esau that populated here? And I think the sons of Lot are somewhere with Moab and maybe Ammon too, but the point is, God had given them that land. God had not promised this land to Israel. So as they're going through here, he says, don't mess with them. And so they don't. They actually help Israel on the way. So that's the three sections in chapter 2, I believe. It's talking about your journeys through the wilderness. However, then you get to 2 kings that weren't very cooperative, and these at the beginning of Deuteronomy and also now, we learn about these two kings' names. Can you guys find them again? I can't remember what their names were. Sihon and who? Og. Okay. So they were Amorites who were kind of in this area, but it talks about them being Amorites beyond the Jordan. So they actually lived over in this area. Sihon was near, I think it says he's in Heshbon, which is here. And Og was, I can't remember the name of it, but, Bashan, like the cows of Bashan. He was up in that area. So these were the two kings that they hadn't been promised any land over here. So in other words, they weren't under God's protection as belonging there. They also weren't very nice to Israel. Israel just wanted to pass through, we're not going to take anything. We're not going to steal anything. Just let us get through because we need to get from here to here. That's where we're going. Okay. But they wouldn't let them, remember? So Sihon came out to battle. How did he do with Israel? He lost, all right? Og probably got scared. He came out to battle with Israel. How did he do? He lost too, all right? So this is what's happened the last few years is that your army has really gotten exercised here. And you've seen with God's help the defeat of Sihon, the defeat of Og, and now you're here on these plains of Moab, which is, I think it's kind of like this general area here, and looking out over Israel. So that's where you've gotten up till now. Okay, so after 40 years, you're finally at the border. You're standing here at the very border of the promised land and looking out over it. This would be kind of high up, and this is a little bit more low. I was imagining, you guys know when you drive north through the Grapevine and you come down over and you see the whole expanse of that Central Valley. That's kind of how I imagine them coming up to this mountain and looking out and seeing all of Israel. And this is the land that they were to go inhabit. This is the land that God had promised to give to them. And so this is kind of the situation that you find yourself as a child now who's grown up through all of this history. All that generation, that first generation has died off. And what I want you to think about is just the significance for you as a child now who has grown up seeing God's power and God's work among you. You've seen how your parents had the chance to enter into this land and they failed. It's even more embarrassing than we went into. They actually weren't supposed to go fight them because God says, I'm not going to be with you. And they went ahead and fought and they got beat too. But now it's your turn. Now you're standing up and looking out over the land as well. And the question then is, how are you going to live? That's a lot of what Deuteronomy gets at. It's trying to motivate you as God's people now to be faithful, to know that God's faithful to you, and to go in and take the land. Because every time God has fought for you, every time you've seen victory. And every time you've tried to fight without God's help, you've seen defeat, right? So the question isn't whether or not you're ready or you're powerful enough or you're organized enough. The question is God with you? And that's what faithfulness looks like in the Old Testament. It's remembering that God is with them and that he's the one who's able to help them to carry out what he promises to do. Okay, so I guess to kind of wrap up here, do you guys see any analogies with Israel's life and our lives today? A lot of times we look in the Old Testament and we think it was so different for them, right? Do you see how many parallels there are for us as Christians today with what what they were going through in Deuteronomy as well. You guys start to see that? What questions do you have? Maybe differences that you're seeing, or maybe questions about, I think there'd definitely be questions about the law. Like, how does the law function for them? And how does the law function for us? Is it the same? You might ask, what does it mean to be God's people in the Old Testament? And what does it mean to be God's people in the New Testament? And how different are those? Are they completely different groups? Or are we really one group of people called God's people? How were God's people helped in the Old Testament? What would be motivating to them? What would be encouraging to them? What did they need in terms of maybe how were they able to be faithful to the Lord? And how is that any different from us today? Those are some questions to think about, but sorry, you guys have any questions about Deuteronomy? These are questions I've been having, so I can't wait to get into it.
Well, one question is our parents were the people of God, and with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, they all died. And in the analogy to the church, it's interesting that, at least on a percentage basis, not all of the people in the church are going to get the promise.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, 2 out of probably 1.5 million or something.
Mm.
I'm not saying it applies statistically, but
Mm-hmm.
an awful lot of people heard the promise, were led by God, had every reason to go in, and not many went in.
Mm.
Not many, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, held on to trusting in God.
Mm. Yeah.
It's interesting that huge number of people that were essentially the church that died.
Hmm. Okay, so you said a couple things there that we might want to dig into more. So good thoughts, Steve. John?
I think one of the things that strikes me, I think you can deduce by good and necessary consequence that those people that died before the end of the promised land did not do what Moses told them to do in Deuteronomy 6. Teach this to your children when you lie down, when you rise up, when you eat, when you go out.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't either.
Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of instruction here for parenting, right? Yeah, a lot of very interesting thoughts about who are the people of God? Because in one sense, you would say, all these people here, they were Israel, right? But there's a sense in which not all Israel is Israel, right? As Romans puts it. So what's that distinction like in the Old Testament? And then does that play out in the New? Does that play out in the church as well? Where we might call, in a sense, this is the church, but in a sense, this is the church, right? Does that make, so some good things to think about. We'll get into. Anything else?
Covenant application, how do you know the difference between being visibly, superficially in the covenant and actually in the covenant, so that your confidence is God's action in the covenant?
Yeah. You bring up the term covenant. That's one thing I'd really like to spend some extra time in Deuteronomy looking at, is what is a covenant and how does it function in the life of God's people? And how does it function, if at all, today? There's if we went through Hebrews, I think Hebrews might be a good follow-up to this, just because there's so much in Hebrews about covenant and whether or not you're in the covenant and what covenant faithfulness looks like. And we're going to see a lot of what Deuteronomy teaches us, help us to understand what Hebrews is saying as well. So, John, is your hand up?
Question I don't think it's maybe answered is those that did not enter the kingdom, were they still in the covenant, and did they go to heaven? You know, we were thinking of heaven, now enter into heaven. And I would think that they did enter into heaven. Deuteronomy doesn't address that, I don't think, but they died because of their unbelief at this one point. But does that make them, completely pagan and total unbelievers? That's just sort of a question came up. I don't think we can answer. I don't know if you can answer that question.
Definitely not today, but it does bring up, the question of, we've got hymns that we sing about crossing into the promised land or crossing into Canaan, right? Is that exactly analogous to going to heaven, or is it analogous? So, like, what's the analogy with that? So something to look at, but we won't have an answer today for sure. All right, well, I'm really looking forward to going through Deuteronomy. If you want, I'm kind of using this book as kind of a loose reference. It's a 12-week Bible study with questions and answers. This one happens to be written by an OP pastor. It's a good series nonetheless, or never, regardless of who this is. But anyway, I'm not following this exactly, so don't hold me to it, but it kind of gives a general guideline of what I'm going to be going through each week. Okay. All right. Let's thank the Lord. Father, we're so grateful for your word. I pray, Lord, that you would make us excited about studying the Old Testament and Deuteronomy specifically. Help us to see what a great help this is for us as Christians even today. Lord, help us in our discussion, in our study, and most of all, that you would apply it to our lives and change us to be more like the people you want us to be. We thank you for this time in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thank you all.